18 American soldiers, roughly 500 German paratroopers, one ridge, in Belgium, on the opening morning of the Battle of the Bulge. 20-1. That's not a typo, that's the actual math the men on that hill were doing while the shooting started. And when it was over, they hadn't just survived. They'd become the most decorated small unit of its size in the entire American army in World War II. No fortress, no reinforcements, no secret weapon, just 18 men, a tree line, and a battalion that outnumbered them the way a wolf pack outnumbers one man with a rifle. So the question isn't whether they held. It's how. 18 men, plus 4 artillery observers who happened to be standing nearby when the morning started. 22 Americans dug into a ridge above a village called Lanzerath on December 16, 1944, the opening day of the Battle of the Bulge. Against them, roughly 500 German paratroopers. A full battalion, veterans, backed by the armor, now stalled behind them. 20-1. On a good day for the math. This wasn't a good day for the math. And they held. Not for a few minutes. Not for an hour. The better part of a day, against a force that outnumbered them the way a wolf pack outnumbers a man with a rifle. Here's the irony nobody planned for. Those 18 men weren't even a combat unit. They were an intelligence platoon trained to watch and report, not to fight. By the time the war caught up with what they'd actually done, they'd become the most decorated small unit in the entire American army in World War II. So the real question isn't what happened at Lanzerath. It's how 18 men did this, to 500. To answer that, we have to go back 3 days to the moment nobody thought this platoon belonged here at all. Nobody thought this platoon belonged here. That was the point. In the fall of 1944, the Ardennes was where the American High Command sent divisions to rest, not to fight. The terrain was thick forest and steep, narrow roads, the kind of ground armies avoided. Not the kind they attacked through. 60 miles of front, and Allied planners had convinced themselves the Germans simply didn't have the fuel, the men, or the nerve to come through it. So when the 99th Infantry Division arrived in early December, green, untested, most of them fresh off transport ships and still learning which end of a foxhole faced the enemy, they were told the same thing every new division in a quiet sector gets told. Settle in. Get some sleep. Nothing's going to happen here. Attached to the 99th 394th Infantry Regiment was a small outfit called the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 18 men, whose entire job was to watch the woods and radio back what they saw. Not to hold ground. Not to fight pitched battles. To watch and to talk on the radio. Their commander was a first lieutenant named Lyle Buch, and if you'd passed him on the street you might have guessed he was still in high school. He wasn't far off. Buch had lied about his age to enlist in the National Guard at 14. By 20, he was one of the youngest officers in the entire United States Army, commanding a platoon whose job description didn't include what was about to happen to it. Nobody told the Germans it was a quiet sector. On the other side of that forest, Adolf Hitler had staked what remained of Germany's mobile striking power on one enormous gamble, a counteroffensive through the Ardennes, splitting the American and British armies and driving all the way to the port of Antwerp, before anyone could stop it. The plan was audacious, and it depended entirely on one thing. Speed. Grab the momentum in the first hours, punch through before the Americans could react, and keep moving faster than anyone thought possible in December. In the mountains, in the snow. The tip of that spear was a force called Kampfgruppe Piper, nearly 5,000 men, 600 vehicles, 117 tanks, all pointed at a handful of narrow roads that were the only way through this stretch of Belgium. And here's the part of the plan that mattered most. The tanks weren't supposed to do the fighting first. The infantry was. German commanders had built their timetable around a simple division of labor. Send the paratroopers ahead to clear each village, each road junction, each pocket of resistance quickly, cheaply, without exposing the armor to ambush in tight country, where a single anti-tank gun in a barn could turn a column of tanks into a very expensive traffic jam. Once the infantry cleared the path, Piper's armor would come through behind them at speed and keep going, day and night, until they reached the Meuse River. The whole offensive was built on the assumption that this handoff infantry clears, armor exploits would happen in hours, not days. It didn't happen in hours. And the first crack in that plan had nothing to do with the Americans at all. Months earlier, retreating German engineers had blown up a railway overpass near Losheim to slow the Allied advance. Standard practice: you blow the bridges behind you so the enemy can't use your own roads to chase you. Except now the enemy wasn't chasing anyone. Germany was attacking through the same ground it had wrecked on the way out, and nobody had gotten around to rebuilding what they'd destroyed. The bridge was still down. The road the entire offensive's timetable depended on was blocked by a wound the German army had inflicted on itself. So the battalion assigned to clear that route did what armies do when the planned road disappears. They diverted. And the detour ran straight through a village most of them had never heard of, past a ridge nobody on the German side considered worth mentioning in the briefing. A ridge with 18 men dug into it. At 5:30 that morning, the sky over the Ardennes opened up. This wasn't a scattered German patrol testing the wire, it was the opening barrage of Hitler's entire offensive. 1,600 guns firing along an 80-mile front, the ground shaking under men who, an hour earlier, had been told nothing was going to happen here. In his foxhole above Lanzerath, Buch felt the same shockwave every green soldier along that line felt that morning, the sudden sickening realization that the map had lied to him. He did what his job actually was. He got on the radio. An intelligence platoon that finds itself sitting on top of the main German advance doesn't stay and fight. It reports what it sees and gets out, so the information can do some good somewhere safer. That was the entire reason this unit existed: eyes and ears, not a rifle line. Buch radioed battalion, laid out what he was watching gather in the valley below him, and asked for permission to pull back before that force reached his position. The answer that came back over the radio wasn't what he expected. Hold your ground. Report what you see. It would be easy, looking back, to read that order as a mistake, some overwhelmed staff officer in the chaos of the first morning, not grasping what he was asking 18 men to do. It wasn't a mistake. Whoever gave that order understood the math as well as Buch did. They also understood something else. This stretch of road, this exact ridge, was the only route a huge piece of the German advance could use to get where it was going. Somebody had to slow that column down, even for an hour, even for 20 minutes, to buy the rest of the line time to wake up and react. It didn't have to be a victory. It just had to be a delay. Command wasn't asking this platoon to win a battle. They were asking it to become an obstacle, a speed bump in front of a force built entirely around the idea that nothing would slow it down. And they were asking a reconnaissance unit, trained to run from exactly this kind of fight, to do it instead. Down in the valley, the German battalion that had been rerouted around a bridge nobody rebuilt began to move. 500 men, coming up the same open ground the platoon had been watching for days, walking toward a ridgeline they had every reason to believe was empty, or close to it. Buch put down the radio handset. Up and down the tree line. 18 men who'd enlisted to watch and report settled into position instead to do something none of them had trained for. They weren't soldiers by trade. In about 4 minutes, that stopped mattering. They weren't soldiers by trade. In about 4 minutes, that stopped mattering. Look at who was actually in those foxholes. Technical Sergeant William Slape, steady, the kind of NSO a green platoon builds itself around without anyone deciding to. Private First Class William Chakanikas, crouched behind a .50 caliber machine gun bolted to a jeep, a gun meant for suppressing aircraft and vehicles, not holding a tree line, but the only heavy weapon they had, so it would have to do both. And around them, a scattering of privates and corporals barely out of their teens, most of whom had never fired a shot at another human being. 3 weeks earlier, half of them had been in basic training stateside. Now they were the only thing standing between a German battalion and the road behind them. Down the slope, coming into view through the tree line, was the other side of the equation. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment wasn't a scratch outfit thrown together for this offensive. These were paratroopers, elite by German standards, hardened by years of fighting on multiple fronts, men who'd survived Crete and Monte Cassino and the retreat across France. To them, this looked like exactly what German intelligence had told them it would be. A thin, quiet American line manned by green replacements, the kind of resistance you brush aside on your way to somewhere that actually matters. They had every reason to expect an easy morning. Nothing in their training or their experience prepared them for what that tree line was about to do to that assumption. And behind those paratroopers, a few miles back and closing the distance by the hour, sat the reason none of this could afford to go slowly. Somewhere in that stalled column was a colonel named Hoffman, technically senior to the SS officer who'd eventually come storming into his command post, demanding answers, a colonel who, when that moment came, would find it easier to defer to a subordinate in a black coat than to pull rank the way the book said he could. That confrontation was still hours away, but the reason for it was already forming, right now, in the gap between what the German plan expected to find on this ridge and what was actually waiting there. Because here's the thing nobody on either side had gotten right yet. The Germans assumed this would be easy. The Americans' own command, radioing back an order to hold this line, understood it would be hard, but even they didn't fully grasp what they were asking 18 men and 4 artillery observers to survive. Every assumption walking into that morning was about to be wrong in some direction. That's the part that makes what happened next worth watching closely. Buch had his men positioned along the wood line, weapons trained on the open field below, watching a road that ran through open ground with nothing between it and them but cold air. The plan, such as it was, had been worked out without much time to refine it. Let the lead German elements walk into range, hold fire until the position was committed, then open up all at once and make the first seconds count. Surprise was the only advantage they had. Once it was spent, it wouldn't come back. Down in the field, the German column began to move, first scouts, then a loose column of paratroopers walking up the slope with the unhurried confidence of men who didn't expect a fight. Buch watched them come. He'd given his men the signal to wait. Not yet. Not yet. Every second that column advanced deeper into the open ground was a second closer to a kill zone, with no cover in it. And then something happened that wasn't in anybody's plan. A young girl from the village walked out onto that same stretch of ground, right into the space between the advancing Germans and the American guns trained on them. She wasn't part of the war. She was just a kid from Lanzareth, caught in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment, walking home or running an errand or doing whatever ordinary thing had seemed perfectly safe an hour earlier. Every rifle on that ridge was sighted in on the field she was standing in. Buch held. He'd spent the last several minutes waiting for the right second to give the order that would open the ambush, the one chance his platoon had to even the odds before this turned into an open firefight against 500 men. And now, with German officers close enough to see clearly, with the moment he'd been building toward finally arriving, he held his hand instead of dropping it. He was not going to give the signal to open fire with a child standing in the middle of the field. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's not the obvious choice. Every second Buch waited was a second his platoon's one real advantage surprise was bleeding away. The Germans kept walking. The gap kept closing. A commander thinking purely in terms of tactics would have found a reason to fire anyway, or told himself the girl would be fine, or simply run out of patience. Buch didn't. He watched her cross that open ground, small and slow against a field full of armed men who didn't yet know she was there to worry about, and he waited until she reached her door and disappeared inside it. Only then did his arm come down. And the surprise wasn't gone at all. The Germans hadn't slowed, hadn't spread out. hadn't done anything differently in those extra seconds. They had no idea any of this had just happened. The ambush landed exactly the way it would have a minute earlier, full force, no warning, the entire platoon opening up at once into a column of men who thought they were walking into an empty morning. Chakanikas's 50 caliber opened first, tracers cutting into a road that had, seconds before, looked completely undefended. Rifles followed. The disciplined veteran paratroopers of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, men who had fought across half of Europe, found themselves diving for whatever cover an open field could offer, caught in fire from a position their own intelligence had told them barely existed. One good decision, made under pressure, for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics, cost this platoon nothing and revealed exactly who was commanding it. But a single ambush, however clean, doesn't explain what came next. It doesn't explain how 18 men, having spent their one moment of surprise, went on to hold that ridge against wave after wave of a battalion 20 times their size, for hours, through the rest of that freezing day. That part isn't about a good opening shot. That part is about ground and geometry, and what happens when 500 men can't tell how many rifles are actually shooting at them. That part isn't about a good opening shot. That part is about ground and geometry, and what happens when 500 men can't tell how many rifles are actually shooting at them. Here's what that ridge actually was. Stripped of the fog and the smoke and the fear, a wood line sitting slightly above an open field. That's it. No concrete, no wire, no minefields. Just foxholes dug into frozen ground under tree cover, looking down a slope with nothing on it to hide behind, no walls, no ditches, no dead ground a man could crawl through unseen. Anyone crossing that field toward the platoon's position was exposed the entire way, from the moment they left the tree line at the bottom to the moment they either reached the top or didn't. 18 men had spent their time on that hill doing one useful thing with it. They'd figured out exactly which strip of that field belonged to which rifle. Nothing formal. No engineers, no range cards stamped by battalion. Just 18 men who'd looked at the ground in front of them enough times to know, without needing to think about it, where their own bullets would land. When the shooting started, nobody had to call out targets. Everybody already knew their piece of the field, and the platoon put fire across the entire slope at once, edge to edge, with no gaps in it. That's the whole mechanism. A position with one accessible approach, no cover on that approach, and a handful of men who'd already done the thinking about where to shoot before they needed to do it under fire. It shouldn't have mattered. 500 men can absorb losses that would break most units and keep coming. Especially veteran paratroopers who'd already done exactly that on half a dozen fronts. A well-led battalion, accepting the casualties, could walk straight through a position like this in the time it takes to eat breakfast. That was the German plan, more or less. Clear the ridge, keep moving, stay on schedule. Except the battalion commander down in that valley had a problem the map couldn't tell him how to solve. He could see fire coming from the tree line. He could not see how much of it there was, or how many men were producing it. A tree line at range looks the same, whether it's holding 20 men or 200. The muzzle flashes don't come with a name tag attached. And every time his men pushed forward and got cut down by fire from 3 or 4 directions at once, the natural read on that information wasn't 18 men are very well positioned. It was there's more up there than we thought. So instead of committing everything at once, the one move that probably would have worked, given the numbers, the German command did something that made sense in the moment and was fatal in hindsight. They probed. They pulled back. They reorganized, waited for a clearer picture, and tried again with a slightly different angle, hoping to find the gap in a line that, as far as they could tell, didn't have one. Each attempt cost them men. Each attempt also cost them something more valuable and harder to get back: time. And behind that hesitation, stretching back down the road for miles, sat the reason none of this could afford to take all day. Kampfgruppe Piper wasn't a company or even a division slice waiting its turn. It was close to 5,000 men and 600 vehicles, 117 tanks, 149 half-tracks, artillery pieces heavy enough to level a village. All of it queued up on roads too narrow to pass on, waiting for word that the infantry had done its one job and cleared the way. Picture that column stretched out through the Ardennes forest, engines idling, fuel burning while they sat still, an armored fist built to punch clean through the American line, and instead parked bumper to bumper behind a fight nobody down the road could see the size of. Every hour those 18 men held that ridge was an hour that entire machine sat exactly where it was. A battalion the size of the one attacking Lanzerath, against a position this thinly held, was supposed to clear that ground in under an hour. That was the assumption baked into the whole German timeable infantry moves fast. Armor follows immediately, the whole offensive stays on schedule. Instead, the fighting at Lanzerath ran for most of that day. By the time it was finally decided, the Germans had taken something on the order of 90 casualties or more killed, wounded. Men dragged back down that same exposed slope they just crossed going the other direction. 90 plus casualties, and the better part of a full day, spent taking a position that, on paper, should never have held past mid-morning. That gap between what should have happened and what actually did is where the story stops being about tactics and starts being about the men stuck at the far end of that traffic jam, watching the clock. Just after midnight, one of those men finally reached the front of it. Joachim Piper's column rolled into Lanzerath hours behind where it was supposed to be, and Piper himself went looking for whoever was responsible. He found him in a calf the Germans had turned into a command post Colonel Helmut Hoffmann, commanding the Fallschirmjäger regiment that had spent the day stuck outside this village. On paper, Hoffmann outranked him. Piper wore an SS colonel's insignia. Hoffmann was Wehrmacht and senior. It didn't matter. This is one of those small telling details that says more about how the German war machine actually worked than any organizational chart could. The officer who technically had the authority to tell an SS colonel to mind his own business chose, instead, to explain himself. "Why have you stopped?" Piper wanted to know. Hoffmann tried to lay it out resistance stronger than expected. The ground uncertain, possible mines. He reached for the map. Piper didn't wait for him to unfold it properly. He grabbed it himself and pinned it to the wall with 2 bayonets, because that was faster than finding a nail, and started demanding answers from anyone in the room who might have one. He got a major on the phone. The major hadn't personally checked the ground ahead. He got a captain on the phone instead. Same answer. Nobody in that chain of command had actually gone forward and looked at what was in those woods with their own eyes. They'd been making decisions off assumption and second-hand reports for hours, while an entire armored spearhead sat still behind them. Piper slammed the phone down. "There's nothing out there," he told the room. Whether he believed that or was simply furious enough to say it, the effect was the same hours had been lost to a standoff between a battalion that thought it might be facing something bigger than it was, and a commander now insisting, at midnight, with no more information than anyone else in that calf, that the whole thing had been an overreaction. It's worth saying plainly, we don't have a court transcript of this argument. What survives are the accounts of the men who were there, close enough in language and detail across multiple retellings that historians treat the substance of it as solid: the delay, the confrontation, Piper's fury, the map on the wall. The exact words are a reconstruction, not a quotation lifted off a page, but nobody disputes what it cost him. Even with Piper standing in that room at midnight ordering the advance to continue, his column didn't actually start moving again until 4:30 the next morning. Call it what you want, the last hours of confusion, the physical business of getting a 5,000-man force back into motion in the dark, the argument itself eating the clock. However you slice it, an offensive built entirely around speed had just spent the better part of a day and most of a night going nowhere, because of a ridge that, by every reasonable calculation, 500 men should have cleared before lunch. Back on that ridge, the platoon that had done this to him didn't know any of it was happening. They knew something simpler. And worse, they were running out of everything. Ammunition that had seemed like enough that morning had burned through hour after hour of sustained fighting. Men were rationing what was left, choosing shots instead of laying down covering fire, watching belts and clips get thinner with no resupply coming, and no way to get one. The Germans, for all their hesitation, eventually did what a patient enemy with unlimited numbers can always do to a position it can't take head-on. They stopped trying to walk straight up the middle of that field and worked their way around it instead, finding the edges of a line that had never had enough men to cover its own flanks in the first place. There was no final dramatic charge that broke this position. No last stand with fixed bayonets in the movie sense. The ending was quieter and more exhausted than that. As dusk came down over the ridge, the platoon found itself surrounded, out of ammunition, with nothing left to trade for more time. They'd already given everything that mattered, hours earlier, in every assault that failed before this one. What happened at dusk was just the bookkeeping catching up to a fight that had, in every way that counted, already been decided. They laid down their weapons. 18 exhausted, freezing young men who'd shown up to observe a war, walked instead into captivity as prisoners of it with absolutely no idea, standing there in the dark, that a few miles down the road, an entire German armored column had spent their whole day sitting still because of them. They laid down their weapons. 18 exhausted, freezing young men who'd shown up to observe a war, walked instead into captivity as prisoners of it with absolutely no idea, standing there in the dark, that a few miles down the road, an entire German armored column had spent their whole day sitting still because of them. They wouldn't find out for a long time. Some of them wouldn't find out for decades. What they couldn't see, marching off that hill at gunpoint, was what those stolen hours actually bought. While the platoon was being searched and counted and marched east, the divisions behind them, the 99th, the 2nd Infantry, green outfits that had spent the morning getting shelled awake in a sector everyone had promised them was quiet, were using the time Lanzareth had handed them to do the one thing that mattered most. They fell back. They dug in. They consolidated on a stretch of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge, and they held it. Not for an afternoon. For 10 days, against everything the German 6th Panzer Army could throw at it. Elsenborn never fell. It became the shoulder the entire northern half of the German offensive broke against. And it existed, in the shape it existed, because the men supposed to be defending it had gotten there in time, instead of getting run over on the road, the way the German timetable had assumed they would. 18 men hadn't won the Battle of the Bulge. Nobody's claiming that. But they'd bought the hours that let somebody else win the part of it that mattered most in this sector. And that's not a small thing to have done with a morning. Kampfgruppe Piper never got that morning back. It's a strange kind of justice, if you want to call it that. The force that spent half a day and half a night furious about being stopped by 18 men went on to have a much worse week than that. Piper's column pushed west after Lanzareth, fast and violent, exactly as designed. It just never caught back up to its own schedule. American units it should have brushed aside kept slowing it down at bridges, at river crossings, at towns that should have fallen in an hour and instead cost a day. By the time the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to get involved, Pipers spearhead the tanks, the half-tracks, the artillery that had been queued up bumper to bumper behind a ridge full of American privates was trapped near a town called La Glise. Out of fuel, out of options, and out of time. What was left of it didn't break through to the Meuse River. It didn't get anywhere close. Somewhere around 800 men walked back to German lines on foot, abandoning the tanks where they sat, having covered less than half the distance the entire offensive was supposed to travel in its first week. An armored fist built to punch through Belgium in days ended up crawling back to Germany on foot. That's not a coincidence you can draw a single straight line to. But it starts, in every account that's tried to trace it, on a ridge above a village called Lanzarote at 5:30 in the morning, with a bridge nobody had rebuilt and a platoon that wasn't supposed to be there. None of that was visible to the man who'd actually commanded that platoon. Lyle Boak spent the rest of the war, and years after it, believing he'd failed. That's not a figure of speech, it's what he told people. What he apparently told himself. He'd lost his entire unit, he'd been captured. In the only version of events available to him from inside a German prison camp, that looked like exactly what it was. A defeat. He had no way of knowing about Elsenborn Ridge holding, or Kampfgruppe Piper stalling out in the snow a few days later, or any of the shape his morning had ended up giving to the rest of that battle. He just knew he'd been overrun, and he carried that the way men carry the worst day of their war quietly, for a long time. It took him years to learn the rest of it. And once he did, he didn't let it go. Book spent decades afterward doing something almost nobody expects from the man at the center of a story like this. He stopped talking about himself and started fighting for everybody else in that platoon. The army had recognized him, eventually, with a Silver Star. It hadn't done the same for most of the other 17 men who'd been in those foxholes beside him. The ones who'd fired that .50 caliber, who'd rationed ammunition through the afternoon, who'd walked into the same POW camps he had. Bouk lobbied. He wrote letters. He pushed a case in front of Congress that most of Washington had every reason to have forgotten by then. He wasn't interested in a better medal for himself. He wanted the men who'd actually been on that ridge to have their names attached to what they'd done. On paper, before it was too late. It took 37 years. In October of 1981, at Fort Myer, Virginia, the United States Army finally settled its account with the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, 10 Bronze Stars with the device for valor. A Presidential Unit Citation for the platoon as a whole, the kind of recognition usually reserved for units many times its size. By the time the last medal was pinned on, 18 men who had been told, on the coldest morning of their lives, to hold a position that wasn't supposed to be held, had become the most decorated small unit of its size in the entire American military in the Second World War. And here's the detail that tends to get lost once the medals show up in the story. All 18 of them lived to see it. Every man who went into those foxholes above Lanzarote walked out of the war alive. Despite what came after the surrender, the frozen march east, the boxcars. Camps where American prisoners died of disease and neglect in numbers that should embarrass anyone who still romanticizes what captivity looked like in 1944 and 45. 18 men held a ridge nobody thought could be held for a day nobody thought would matter. And then 18 men survived what came next, too. Neither half of that was guaranteed. There's a hill above Lanzarote today that looks like almost nothing. Grass, a tree line, a view down a slope that's gone quiet in every sense a battlefield can go quiet. In 2005, veterans of the division that had once been told this sector was safe came back with the people of the village and put up a small memorial, a brass plaque, a bench, an American flag. Nothing built to overwhelm anyone who wasn't already looking for it. You could walk past it without knowing what happened on that ground, which is, in its own way, exactly what almost did happen to this story for 37 years. Somewhere in that gap between the hill as it looks now and the hill as it was that morning is the actual answer to the question this film opened with. Not how 18 men stopped 500, that part's mechanical, explainable, a matter of ground and fire discipline and an enemy that couldn't see how thin the line really was. The harder question was always whether any of it would be remembered as what it actually was, or simply dissolve into the noise of a battle that involved 500,000 men on both sides. It didn't dissolve. It took a man who thought he'd failed, and 37 years of him refusing to let that be the end of the story. But it didn't dissolve. Piper got his answer that first night, standing in a cold calf with a map pinned to the wall by bayonets, demanding to know how much force had stopped his column cold. He never got a number that satisfied him, because no number would have. 18 wasn't the kind of answer a man builds an army around. It's just the number of men it actually took, that morning, on that hill. To be impossible to break.